Good morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Clive Bartlett and I'm part of the church here at Emmanuel. Last time I spoke with you a few weeks ago, I shared a bit about a verse that David wrote in Psalm 23, where he says to the Lord, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Today I want to reflect a bit more upon the table that verse is ultimately pointing us to, the table that Jesus sets before us in the breaking of bread. On the night he was arrested, as Jesus looked to communicate to the disciples what the cross was about and what it would mean to them, he turned again to the image of a table. And this is how Paul describes that night in 1 Corinthians 11. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me." So in order to communicate all that the cross means and our daily need of its power fresh in our minds, Jesus invites us to a meal. In fact, he doesn't just invite us to one meal, he invites us to come and sit at his table and regularly partake of meals. So it's an invitation that speaks of family, it speaks of close family. Who do you sit at the table with most days? And it's family. And so this is an invitation of full acceptance, of hospitality, of welcome, of intimacy, of closeness. And it's an invitation that speaks of much more, but the main thing it speaks of is love. This table that Jesus invites us to is built on love, and all the other things that are on it flow from that great love. In the Old Testament, there's a book called Song of Songs or Song of Solomon that many of you will know, and it's a romantic love poem. In that story, there's two main characters. There's the Shulamite and there's her lover as well. And in one passage, this is how the Shulamite describes her lover. "Like an apple tree among the trees of the forest is my lover among the men. I sat down in his shade with great delight, and his fruit was sweet to my taste." And then she says this, "He has brought me to his banqueting hall, and his banner over me is love." So first of all, she says he's like an apple tree among the trees of the forest. In other words, he is the one who refreshes her. He is the one who makes her come alive. He's the one who makes her feel alive. He's the one who revives her. And she feels so comfortable in his presence that she comes and sits down in his shade with great delight. It's a picture of joyful rest. She's saying, "I feel at home here. I feel welcomed here. I feel like I can be myself here." In his shade, she's protected, she's covered, she's shielded from the sunlight. And then the picture changes and she says, "He has brought me to his banqueting hall." And as we imagine the scene in the banqueting hall, the first thing we would think of would be a table laid out with beautiful food. And again, it's a picture of her sitting down, enjoying his presence, taking time with him, savouring his goodness, just enjoying him. And there in that place, as she sits taking her time with him, she is convinced of something. "His banner over me is love," she says. There at that table, she savours his goodness. She is persuaded of his great love for her. In the passage I read to you comes in chapter 2 of Song of Songs. But previously in the song up to this point, she sang of his love, his great love generally. And she sang of how he's loved by many. And she's also sang of how she loves him. But this is the first time in the song where she sings of his great love specifically for her. So here at the table, as she feasts upon him, she's persuaded of his great love. She's persuaded of how deeply she is loved. Now, of course, Song of Songs is a romantic love poem, but it's always pointing us to something even greater than romantic love. It's pointing to Jesus Christ's great love for his church and love for each of us individually, and the love that emerges in us as we see his love. And so in this banqueting hall scene, there's much that speaks of communion as we sit down and we enjoy his goodness, we savour his goodness, as we reflect upon what he's done for us, what he's provided for us. We're persuaded of his love. His banner over us is love. Now, in the book of Song of Solomon, really you can imagine it's two lovers absorbed in each other, and it's a picture of love and joy throughout. There's occasional glimpses of fret, but there's not many enemies around. But in David's picture, where he sits at the table himself, the Lord has prepared a table before him in the presence of his enemies. And yet even there, David is able to sit down, he's secure, he's able to take his time and feast upon what God has provided for him, even with his enemies looking on. Psalm 23, where that verse occurs, is a reflection on experiencing God's goodness throughout life, of walking through life with God, and even through death with God as well. And in all that David has been through and all that he's experienced, he is persuaded of God's love. So David, as he sits down, he's secure in God's love. There's a passage in the New Testament where the Apostle John writes, perfect love casts out fear. And that's what we're seeing from David there. He's so convinced of the Lord's love for him that he's able to sit securely and feast in that place, even with the enemies looking on. And so too for us at the communion table, as we see all that God has given for us, all that Jesus Christ has given for us, then we are persuaded of his love. We see that Christ is our host, but he offers his very self on this table. As Paul wrote, the Son of God loved me and he gave himself up for me. So he offers his very self. Jesus himself said on the night of the Last Supper, greater love has no man than this, than to lay down his life for his friends. And that's what Jesus was doing. And the value upon our lives is decided by what someone would pay for us. And God gives his very self. He gives everything for us. Jesus Christ gives himself up for us. That is the value of our lives. And that is love. That is the proof of his love. And there at the table, we're convinced of his love. His banner over us is love. Now, even as Jesus spoke those words about greater love has no man, the enemies were already gathering at the door. Judas, of course, was sat at the table ready to betray Jesus. But the greater enemies are outside the door. The forces of death and hell are in motion. And there's a sense of tension and shadow and darkness around the Last Supper as we're aware, and the disciples are aware, even though dimly, they're aware that something is about to happen and it's not going to be good. So Jesus is, even as he speaks and shares with his disciples all the important truths that he's getting across, he is anticipating the greatest trial of his life. And in many ways, the Last Supper is perhaps similar to the meal that the Israelites enjoyed in Egypt as they ate together before the Exodus. So all around, outside, there's the slaughter of the firstborn of the Egyptians, and the Israelites are protected. They've all slaughtered lambs, and they're feasting upon those lambs, but they've also daubed the blood of the lambs upon their doorposts. And this is what Moses says about that meal. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. So in other words, these guys are eating even as they're ready to go. It's a picture of alertness and readiness and and preparing for action. And the Last Supper is very similar to that for Jesus, and even for the disciples. They're aware something is about to happen. They don't quite know what they're meant to be prepared for, but there's a sense of tension around. But even as Jesus spoke those words about greater love as no one than this, I believe that he had in mind for the disciples a greater picture of what communion should be, a clearer picture of what communion should be, and that he was able to share that with his disciples a few days on from this, following the resurrection. And you can read about that account in John chapter 1, but for now I'm going to summarize what happened that day. So disciples, it's following the resurrection. They've all seen Jesus at least once, but it's a few days later, and they're out in the boat and they go fishing all night, and they go through a hard, long and fruitless night. They don't catch anything, and in the morning they're about 100 yards from shore, and the sun's just coming up, and Jesus shouts to them from the shore and says, "Friends, have you any fish?" Now at first they don't recognize him. He's 100 yards away, and they've all seen him once, at least since he's rose from the dead, but they're not just expecting to bump into him anywhere, and so they don't realize it's Jesus. And he advises them, when he realizes they've got no fish, he says, "Put your net on the right side of the boat." And they put their net on the right side of the boat, and they go to pull the fish in, and it's more than the nets can carry. They're struggling to get it in, and finally the penny begins to drop, and John says it's the Lord. And Peter is like an overeager puppy. He just jumps over the side of the boat, swims and wades to shore and comes to Jesus, and the other disciples follow in the boat with the fish. And Jesus has already got a fire going. He's got a bit of a barbecue going, and he's roasting some fish, and he says, "Come and bring some of the fish that you have bought, and come and eat, come and enjoy a meal together." And it's just such a beautiful picture of them encountering the resurrected Christ. Jesus, probably a few weeks before, or maybe longer before, Jesus has spoken some words where he said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in spirit, and you will find rest for your souls." And this morning for the disciples, as they come on the beach and they feast with Jesus and just enjoy his company and just laugh and hang out together and enjoy probably the sun and just all the good things of just relaxing on the beach after such a hard and fruitless and difficult night, would have been like a demonstration of those words, that when we let go of all our fruitless scheming and kind of own ideas and own ways of doing things and come to him and fall at his feet, then we find him, and in him more than we ever longed for, more than we could ever hope for, more than we ever dreamed for. So that must have been like that for the disciples on that morning. There's something more that breakfast on the beach would have spoken to the disciples. Because if you wanted to go for breakfast on the beach, who would you choose to go with? You'd want to go with close friends, family, those you feel most comfortable with, those you most enjoy being with. And it was no different for Jesus that morning. He loved these guys. He wanted to hang out with them. He loved being with them. He'd come to train them up for something, but he just loved them. He was at home with them. They were at home with him. They enjoyed being together. And it was something that was on Jesus' heart. He wanted to share this breakfast on the beach with them. And there's some words that Jesus spoke where he says, "You did not choose me." He said this to his disciples. "You did not choose me, but I chose you." And those words are the truth for each of us. He chose us. It wasn't us that chose him first. He chose us. And we often think we're not worth that much. We often think, who would want to be with us? Who'd want us to be at their breakfast on the beach? Well, he does. He invites us to his table because he wants us with him. It makes him tick being with us, just like it makes us tick being with him. So the communion table is an invitation given out to friends. It's a meal offered to friends. It's about friendship. And it's something wonderful when we see that. And he knows us. He knows how we've messed up. He knows all our failures all along the way. He knows everything that has been wrong. And yet he wants us there with him. And it was like that for Peter on that morning. He carried with him all the heaviness of the days before, where he'd let Jesus down, where he'd failed him, where he'd promised to be there by his side, and he'd just totally not been. And Peter carried with him some of that guilt and shame and stuff like that. Jesus especially wants Peter at his meal. The communion table is a meal given out to the failures, the weak, the wretched, the ones that have messed up. It's an invitation specially given to them. Come and sit at my table. And it's not one meal. Like I said, it's an invitation to family. I want you with me. That's what he says to us. A few days previous to this, to the meal on the beach, the disciples had been there at the Last Supper, and the atmosphere had been darkness and shadow and betrayal and anticipation of something heavy about to happen. But now it is morning, the sun has risen, and they lay down on the beach and they laugh and talk and enjoy life together, and they gaze out upon the beautiful morning colours of the sky and the sea. They see the sun shining on the waves, and they just lay back and they can't believe it. They're there with the resurrected Christ. And it's a picture, a glimpse of what heaven would be like, a glimpse of what is to come. And for these men, as for all men and women, there's still times of disappointment, of brokenness, of sorrow to come. But ultimately, we're going to be with him forever, enjoying his presence forever. One day we will close our eyes on this world and open them forever in a new one. We'll open them forever in a new world, a kingdom of love, a kingdom he has prepared for us. And it is such a picture of joy. It's such a picture of what the resurrection has brought. And Jesus wanted his friends to see that. He wants us to see it. That's why it's in the Bible. He wants us to see the joy that is bubbling over. As we come to this table, as we come to the communion table, we need to carry with us some of the joy of that morning, some of the joy that overflows in being with in the presence of the living Christ, of the risen Christ. The communion table, all that the communion table speaks of is there with them on the beach that morning. The risen Christ and his presence with them. And that is who we're coming to as we come to the communion table. Of course, there is an element of some sorrow and reflection as we consider what he gave for us, what he gave up for us, what he went through for us. But above all, I believe that Jesus wants the picture to be one of joy, because we're celebrating this, we're remembering this, because he didn't stay in the grave. He rose from the dead. And this is a picture of love, of his great love for us. And just like the Shulamite in that picture from Song of Songs, we can feel secure in that love. His banner over us is love. What a wonderful table Jesus has prepared for us. What a beautiful morning on the beach. But what a beautiful life he has brought us into. And what a beautiful day is coming. Thank you, guys.